Hi, everybody, and welcome tonight to our first SEPTA general membership meeting for the school year. We are delighted to have you. We are Fairfax County SEPTA, a county-wide PTA for parents and staff and community members who are connected with special education. You should have received your agenda in the email link. And if you are needing ASL interpretation, there is a link in the Zoom, there is a Zoom link in the description of this video. There's also a link to the agenda in the description of this video. We will be monitoring the chat on YouTube as well. If you want to participate in the chat, you will need to log into your YouTube account. If you're just watching from the initial email and not logged in, you will not be able to access the chat. So that being started, welcome to our meeting. I'm going to call us to order. And being on the internet, we're still working on all the things like a quorum count, but I am anticipating the majority of our board being on. So I would love for us to go ahead and approve our agenda. I'm joined here tonight by ASL interpreters and a few of our board members who are going to be giving brief discussion on a couple different points. So could one of you please move for the agenda?
This is Rich. I move that we approve the agenda.
Thank you, Rich. Is there a second?
This is Amanda. I second.
Thank you. And for our members who are in our Zoom, which are just our presenters, if you would please say aye to approve the agenda.
Aye.
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 All right. Thank you very much. That's our best shot at doing Robert's rules on Zoom. So we're going to move on to our announcements and introduction. For starters, on the agenda at the end of it is a list of all of our different board members and delegates. Some of them are in boldface. You will see those are groups that have committees, and we would love to see people joining in and getting involved. So please feel free to send an email to any of those board members and let us know if you would like to help out. And the best way that you can help out is to join SEPTA. Many of you may be members of our Facebook group, but our Facebook group does not count towards our official membership. We are very privileged to have a voice at the table with school board, with school administration, and our voice is as strong as the size of our membership. So the larger our membership, the stronger our voice. So I encourage everyone to please join SEPTA. If you cannot afford the dues, please send us a message and we'll be happy to accommodate you. I would like to introduce Lauren, one of our board members, who's going to briefly fill you in on our mini grants program.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren McCarthy.
Why don't you turn on your camera so we can see your smiley face? It's not just me.
I show it as on.
Oh, that's my bad. Let me get mine off. Sorry. Technology. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, everyone. My name's Lauren McCarthy, and I'm in charge of our mini grants process this year. We are very excited about these mini grants. Any SEPTA member who is a teacher or a staff can apply for these grants, and they are for three purposes: either to implement programs, to attend professional development, or to obtain materials to support your students. So we strongly encourage you to apply for these. The application deadline this year has been moved to October 15th, and there are details on our website. And we look forward to seeing your applications, and we thank all of you for your incredibly hard work with our students.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And Lynn, if we can jump to you to talk about reflections, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited that we're able to bring reflections back to SEPTA this year. For those of you that don't know, Reflections is National PTA's arts recognition program that allows students to enter their original work based on a theme, and the theme changes every year. This year's theme is really, really exciting for us because it is I Matter Because. And I just am really thrilled and cannot wait to see the entries from our students where they get to show us why they matter and what matters to them. There's information on our website that lists out everything you need to know about entering, all the different categories of entering, because there are 5 or 6 different types of art genres you can enter under. You can also enter as a special artist, and there are some rules to consider under the special artist category. As a special artist, your student would need to use accommodations or assistance from either you or someone else to complete their entry. And that is how you can qualify under special artist. So please let me know if you have any questions about SEPTA, about Reflections, and I'm really looking forward to seeing all of our kids' entries. They are due by October 23rd. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Really appreciate you joining us for that. One other announcement is about our liaisons. We are seeking to have liaisons at every school in FCPS. So the liaison would be communicating SEPTA information to your school's PTA and also collecting information as needed from your school community and bringing it back to SEPTA. If you are interested in helping us out by being a liaison, please go ahead and contact Kate, who is our liaisons chair, and her email address is at the bottom of the agenda as well. And we would love to have you up on our team. As you can see on the agenda, we also have many upcoming events that I'm not going to read off to you in great detail. This week is the FCPS Mental Health and Wellness Conference. It's not too late to register. There are a few more workshops. They've been terrific so far. The NAMI virtual walk is coming up. The ACSD, the Advisory Committee for Students with Disabilities, meets every second Wednesday, and they are open for public comment, which means if you have a story to tell, this is your chance to speak before this committee, which answers to the school board. And also the head administrators for special ed attend those meetings as well. You're given a maximum of 3 minutes. It's scary sometimes the first time you do it, but I totally encourage you or your children to tell their stories. And then in a month, on Tuesday, October 20th, is our next meeting. It will be a virtual meet and greet with our new assistant superintendent, Dr. Michelle Boyd. So we're really looking forward to meeting her, welcoming her, and getting to know her. I'm going to move on now to Rich, who is our treasurer, and he is going to present our budget, and we'll go from there. Rich.
Thank you, everybody. I'm Rich Hem. I'm the treasurer for SEPTA, and 2 housekeeping items we need to do every year relate to spending money and budgets and approvals of, and also the audits. So we've got a proposed budget, and Michelle, I believe we're going to send out a email for voting on this and the details. So this is more of a, I'm going to walk you through it than actually have to decide on it tonight. So
Correct.
Let me pull it up. So are you seeing my Excel spreadsheet now? Yes? Okay. So what we have here is what I put in the budget, which we'll share this to everybody, is you see the budget and actual for the last 2 years. The reason why I think this is important is last year was a very odd year. And you can probably see that we budgeted to spend 11,000 and we only spent 2,100, obviously because of COVID, because of some of our big events. So we do have to pay some of that back in this year. We were cash based, and I'll explain that in a moment. So we ended the year with $12,000 in the bank, mainly because we underspent our budget by quite a bit here. So what we're looking at doing here for, let's talking about the revenue things, the big things to point out are teacher grants and awards. So first on awards, you can see last year we spent a whole $12 on it. We still need to do the plaques and send those plaques out and the certificates and everything to all the winners from last year. But because the way our accounting has to work with PTA rules, it has to come out of this year's budget. So we have extra cash because we didn't spend it last year, but so we're budgeting, we're putting that into this year's budget and moving that up. And it was a very popular event, and hopefully by next spring we can have it in person again after the success in 2019. The next one up, you'll see that has a huge increase in budgeted amount and also in real is going to be teacher grants. We feel that especially this year with the way that students are working remotely and what teachers need to do to help support them, that teacher grants are going to be very, very important. So we're going to, the board feels that we should be making a big push on that this year. So that's why those numbers seem to be so different than past years. There's a lot of general administrative budget in here, and you can see the trends here. When it comes to revenue, continuing where we think we should go for membership, we'll continue to grow a little bit. $3,000 there. Donations is a wild card. It's just what people happen to give us. We've never actually gotten any sponsorships in the last couple of years, so we are just going to put 0 for that now. Fundraising is down quite a bit, and there's a reason for that. 2 of our biggest fundraisers last year, which brought in almost $4,000 total between the 2 of them, were in-person events. And with COVID, we don't know exactly what we're going to be able to do in person. Barnes & Noble will still happen, but we brought in $2,400 with that last year. Will that dip? So we're best not going overboard on that. And then we won't know if we'll be able to have the Blue Iguana event again. So this is mainly superhero memberships, Amazon Smile, and a little bit of Barnes & Noble. We just wanted to be on the safe side here. And grants and donations is down significantly. One big reason is the FCC PTA, which is our parent PTA. Last year gave us a very generous grant of $2,500, which was a big part of that. So we do get grants from other PTAs and national dues reimbursements or whatever. So that's what we put this here. And then that means we're having a huge, what we call reserves contribution based on this, which is we have $12,000 in the bank, and we're going to pretend if we do spend everything, then we'll need to spend 10,000 of that. But really that's in essence very close to what the savings were last year. Combined with the extra push on grants, that's really the difference from this year and previous year's budgets. So do we need to do anything else with that, Michelle, right now, or?
Nope, I think that's it. So the way that we're going to go ahead and get our approval on our budget and also on our audit. We had an audit committee meet and review Rich's extremely well-organized books from last year, but we do need to have those approved by our members. So what we will be doing after this meeting within the next couple of days is sending out an email to all of our members, including information on the budget and the audit, and we will include a link to a Google form where we will ask you to please approve or not, but hopefully approve our budget and our audit for us. So thank you very much, Rich.
Okay, I think I'm done here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So checking at the time, we are actually a few minutes early, which is great because that gives us a few more minutes if need be for Q&A. So we're going to move on with our evening presentation. I am delighted that we are able to have our guests with us this evening. I have been a huge fan of Unstuck and On-Target for many, many years. And I've had the privilege of hearing Dr. Lauren Kenworthy talk about her program before in a meeting with professionals, and I'm delighted to get to hear her again talking with parents and staff as well who are viewing tonight. Dr. Kenworthy is a professor of neurology, pediatrics, and psychiatry at the George Washington University School of Medicine, and is the director of the Center for Autism Spectrum Disorders at Children's National Health System. Dr. Kenworthy received her BA from Yale and her PhD from University of Maryland. Her research interests are in describing the cognitive strengths and treating the cognitive weaknesses of autism. She is the author of more than 70 peer-reviewed publications and of the Behavior Rating Inventory of Executive Function, or BRIEF, as well as the Unstuck and On-Target curricula. She has completed 2 trials of Unstuck and On-Target in schools for children with ADHD or ASD. In addition to having Dr. Kenworthy, I'm also delighted that we have Dr. Christie Hardy with us tonight. She is a member of Dr. Kenworthy's team. They work together. She is in the neuropsychology division of Children's and is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Science and Pediatrics at George Washington University School of Medicine. So what we're going to do this evening is have our guests do their presentation. And if you have questions, please put them into the YouTube chat and we will leave time for Q&A at the end. We will review your questions. So we're going to play musical screens for a moment here and get our hosts on and me off.
Can people see the presentation? Is it the appropriate screen? Okay, great. Hopefully Lauren is also on. We are gonna tag team here, and I'm gonna start off by talking a little bit, and then we're going to pass the mic back and forth, at least virtually speaking, so that we can answer questions and tell you all about the program. I will hopefully be able to move this through. Okay, everybody see that? I should have Lauren do this, but I can toot her horn. She has created the Unstuck and On-Target system for intervention, and this is something that she receives royalties as well as from the brief. If I were so awesome that I could create products like this, I would be excited to tell you about my own conflicts of interest, but I have none. So the goal that we have for tonight is to increase understanding of executive functioning and how they happen in the classroom, and particularly how they may happen during COVID when so many students are learning online, and how you can improve them for your students. So we're going to talk about why executive functions are necessary, how we can teach them. And we do this really through understanding the notion of can't versus won't with students with executive function challenge. And we're going to talk specifically about tools that you can use with students that will help with executive function. And we're also going to talk about this cognitive flexibility curriculum and vocabulary that we call Unstuck and On-Target. So our check for this is using the executive functioning schema that we'll talk about is, can we get it all done? And can you stay awake for the entire time? So this is one of my favorite slides, because I think when I first started learning about executive functioning, I really thought of it as this blue circle at the top. We think of it a lot, I think, as organization, time management, and planning skills that help you organize your day and get your stuff done and plan your tasks and start doing what you need to do. But executive functions are really more than just regulating your thoughts and your planning behaviors. They're also regulating your behaviors and your emotions. And these overlapping circles really tell you that all of these regulation processes, cognitive, behavior, and emotional, are all using the same brain networks. They overlap to some extent. And I like to think of this as meaning that these are brain networks that are using the same source of energy. And this means that to some extent, when you've got an increased drain on one of these areas, you're going to impact how well and how efficiently the other ones operate as well. So this is really key to understanding how your students may deal with executive function in the context of not only their regular classroom behaviors, but also in the context of online classroom associated with COVID. When we talk about executive functions, especially with those circles in mind, some of the things that I think are really important to think about are this idea of cool executive functioning versus hot executive functioning. So when you think of cool executive functioning, these are really like metacognitive tasks, things like playing chess, thinking of your grocery list, things that are maybe problem solving in a game. These are very decontextualized, just thought tasks that don't really necessarily connect to a lot of other things for you. Hot executive functions, on the other hand, are things that you have to use your executive function in conditions where you have a lot of emotional salience. And that can be a lot of different things. It can be excitement. It can be frustration. It can be overwhelm. But essentially, when you've got some emotional charge or salience to a situation, and you're also trying to use your organization, time management, and planning skills, this is when hot executive functions come into play. This is also, coincidentally, most of what we do when we do real-world decision-making. You've got to be able to think about what you want right now. Like when you get home and you're starving from work and you decide, like, there's a giant bag of chips and I really would like to eat those, except that I know that I should start making dinner and try to focus on something healthier. And if I can just wait, I'll be able to eat something that's better for me. So that's an example of sort of hot executive functions. The classic example of hot executive functioning is the marshmallow task. And that is what is shown in this panel on the slide. So in this case, if you aren't familiar with this experiment, a investigator has a child in a room with a marshmallow on a plate. And the researcher says, hey, if you can wait till I come back to eat this marshmallow, I'll give you another one. And the investigator then leaves the room. And what you see in this case is this little boy's attempt to delay gratification, to basically think about the context of getting a second marshmallow instead of what he really wants right now, which is to eat the one in front of him. So it's the ability to problem solve, to manage your emotions, and all of that in the context of something that's emotionally salient. And some of us are great at doing that, and some of us are less great at doing it. And some people have a lot of variability in how they're able to do that. So enter Unstuck. I can talk a little bit about this, but I think I would rather turn it over to Dr. Kenworthy to talk about the first trial and her development of the Unstuck program. And then I can talk a little bit more about where I came in later.
Sure. So we were interested in helping kids develop exactly those skills that Dr. Hardy was just talking about. And flexibility, as you may have noticed in that slide of the circles, is one of those hot executive functions. It's hard to be flexible, and often there's an emotional context and an emotional reaction for kids who are being asked to be flexible. If any of you have ever gotten stuck, as I have repeatedly, with my computer not doing what I think it should do when I push a certain button, and you push that same button over again once, and then maybe twice, and then maybe by the third time you're feeling frustrated, and you're really not being very efficient in your problem solving at that moment, as well as getting upset. So Unstuck and On-Target was devised as a cognitive behavioral intervention, and we trialed it first right in Fairfax County Public Schools. We evaluated it and sort of described it as an intervention for kids with autism. Kids with autism without intellectual disability. We targeted 3rd to 5th graders, and we took 2 groups of kids, one of whom got unstuck, another of whom got an equal dose of parent training, teacher training, small group intervention sessions for the kids, fidelity monitoring. We did everything the same for the 2 interventions. And we then compared how kids changed when they got unstuck versus when they got social skills. And a key thing about this intervention is that it's not implemented by people like Dr. Hardy and myself. It's implemented by school staff, school psychologists, counselors, special educators. And then the next slide shows what happened when we ran this trial. And here you can see we have red bars, and those represent the percent of kids who improved, who went through Unstuck. So before Unstuck happened, we measured certain things, which I'll talk about in a minute, and then we came back and measured them again afterwards. And those red bars show how many kids improved following Unstuck. The blue bars show how many kids improved following the same dose of a social skills intervention. And what did we measure? We were really interested, like Dr. Hardy was saying, in how does executive function look in the real world. So what we did was we had research assistants who didn't know which intervention an individual child was receiving go into the child's mainstream classroom and observe for certain behaviors that are related to executive function, like following the rules, like making transitions, not getting stuck, not getting negative or overloaded, participating in class. These are things that are essential for kids to be successful in school, and they are also directly related to those kinds of executive functions that Dr. Hardy was showing. So for these kinds of behaviors, what you can see is a lot more kids who got unstuck showed significant improvements after the intervention than those who got social skills. Now, luckily, there's some social skills kids who improve too, because people put a lot of work into that, right? So we wanted to see improvement across both interventions, but for these kinds of behaviors, Unstuck was clearly more effective. So we thought that was great, and we thought that this was an autism-specific intervention. And then Dr. Hardy pulled me over in the hallway of Children's National and said, you know, I'm using Unstuck with kids with ADHD, and it works really well. And so I'll let you take it from here, Dr. Hardy.
Yeah, so it is true. That is exactly what happened. I took this book and I also said, so, you know, can you revise your book not to say so much about autism and maybe have some language that would include other children with different learning styles, because this is really effective. We know that children with autism spectrum disorders are particularly vulnerable to being stuck or having problems with cognitive flexibility. But children who have ADHD, and I would also argue children who are anxious or some children with learning difficulties, are also vulnerable to being frustrated and stuck. They have problems, particularly using their good problem skills when they are frustrated or overwhelmed. And for kids with ADHD, as well as kids with anxiety or autism or anything else, the school context is frequently an environment in which they can get or experience frustration or overwhelm. So it's really something that can occur. And we know that in the case of children with ADHD, when they are overwhelmed and they try to use their good problem solving skills, they really get inflexible, and sometimes they will, as I call it, double down on a behavior or a decision that makes absolutely no sense. And it's really because of this difficulty with executive function and flexibility in that hot executive function context. So what Lauren said when I said in the hallway, could you please change this manual to make it a little bit more inclusive of other children, other students with difficulty, she said, okay, as long as you partner with us and help us do this. And that led to the study that we completed a couple of years ago now, which also looked at children in this really critical 3rd to 5th grade age group in 22 Title I schools, including Fairfax County. And this time the included sample was children with autism spectrum disorder, but also children with ADHD. And the common factor for both of those groups were that all of the children were identified to have some problems with cognitive flexibility, particularly in the school setting. So this time, because of the grant that we received to do this work, what we did was, instead of a social skills program being the comparison treatment that we used, we had everybody assigned either to participate in Unstuck and On-Target at the school, or we used what we call a contingency behavior management program. And that's something that we developed to be really similar in at least its structure to Unstuck and On-Target. So it included school-based sessions for kids. It included teacher training, it included parent training, but it was really focused on the stuff that you as teachers learn to implement in the classroom. Token economies, reward systems for children for exhibiting behaviors that you'd like to see more of, and things like that. The great thing about it is that there was really a lot of work that was put in through the assistance of community stakeholders to really talk about adaptations for Title I schools, Spanish or English speaking families, and we really tried to make it student-centered and really involve the community. School personnel were again interventionists, and we trained the school staff and the parents. Lauren, do you want to take over with the results?
Sure. So this is a different way of looking at exactly that same measure we talked about before. So this is classroom observations. In this case, we're showing you the data differently because instead of those 6 different behaviors, we just added them all up. So if a kid did all behaviors, all those 6 behaviors well during the observation, they got a score of 6. If they did none of them, they got a score of 0. And then we looked at this across this x-axis. We looked at how they did before the intervention. And then on the y-axis, we looked at how they did after the intervention. And this is just looking at unstuck data. So this is for the kids who got unstuck. And over here on the left side are the kids with autism. And on the right side are the kids with ADHD. And all the kids that are all those little green bars, that represents a child. The blue bar represents another child, and the red all represent a child. So each bar is a child, and the bars that are in green, those indicate that those children did better on this observation after the intervention than before. So you can see that there's more of those bars up there on the for both autism and for ADHD. But it's also important to acknowledge, and this is something that a lot of people don't think about so much when they do these kinds of studies, that we will not help every child, right? So there are some kids represented by those red bars who didn't do better at the end, regardless of whether they were autism or ADHD. As a whole, though, statistically, kids improved. And this trial showed that you didn't have to have autism to benefit from Unstuck. So there's the stats. That just gives you the statistics.
Sorry about that. That's my fault.
Oh, no. Well, you're on the hook there, Christie.
Okay. So, yes, there we go.
So this third trial, we developed a parent training online series of modules. And again, unfortunately, we got funded for this by the NIMH before Dr. Hardy had gotten to us. So in this case, again, we focused on kids with autism and actually the parents of kids with autism. Although, given what we learned in that PCORI trial, we think that this is effective for a broader number of individuals. When you do these online modules, they speak about autism. So what we wanted to know here was if trainings, kind of like this thing that we're doing tonight, that are done in person, that are very time intensive, that, prior to the days of COVID required parents to get in their car and go to a meeting and required one of us to, fit the evaluation into the training into our schedule, could be replaced equally well by online modules. So this book that we published, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, had kind of the bones of advice for parents about how to understand executive function and how to improve it in their children. The book also speaks to teachers directly, classroom teachers, but it's not for people who are running the whole intervention with the small groups. It's for what you do kind of on the fly to help your child or your student have better executive functions. So working off of this book, we developed these online modules and we compared the in-person to the online modules. And there's some examples here, Christie, if you keep clicking through this, it just shows different components from this training. And what we found was that they were both equally good, both at reducing parent strain and at improving executive functions. Now, I'll tell you, they don't have a huge impact. You can't just do the training and make a major difference in your child, but you do make a significant improvement both in their executive function and for the parents reducing their strain. So I think we'll move on because I know we don't have too much time. So we've talked about why executive functions are necessary, and we've tried to show you a little bit of evidence that we think they're teachable, that we can help kids get better executive functions by training parents, by providing them with these small group interventions. Now I think we want to dive in on kind of this plan that has these three key components of how we think you can improve a child's executive function. And the first thing is you need to understand what the problem is, because you can't fix what you don't understand. So Dr. Hardy, you want to do can't, won't?
Sure. Okay, so I think that this is a real crux of understanding some of the approach to flexibility with students that have executive dysfunction. There are a list of behaviors that can be problematic, not just in the classroom, but at home or with peers, that really look like suspiciously like a child is just refusing to behave in a way that you know that they can do, or at least you think you've seen them do before. So you really think, this child is being just non-compliant. They are not listening to what I'm saying. They're being stubborn, or they're just not motivated. And so a lot of these types of behaviors that it's so easy to interpret that the child won't do what you're asking them to do, could be that they are having trouble and they can't do it. And I think that, the thing to understand here is that sometimes the can't is that they can't do it right now. And so I think this is one of the tensions as teachers and educators and parents, that when you see a child who is exhibiting some struggles and some difficult behaviors, it's tempting to think that they won't do it because you may have seen them do it in some other context. But really, it's that they can't do this right now because of executive function challenges and because of flexibility. So what does this look like? When you see a child who's stubborn because they are not moving on to what you want them to do, they're not transitioning to the next activity that you've planned for their class. It may be because they are overloaded with the activity, and shifting from one thing to another is really difficult for them cognitively. It could be that they really can't do it without some additional structure and support. Again, if you're interpreting that this child can do it if he wants to, sometimes that is more difficult than we know, right? You can say that a child could do it if they were motivated, but finding that motivation for the child, again, if they're doing a task that's motivating right now and you're asking them to move to a task that is less motivating, that's really challenging. It's difficult for some children. And again, there are so many of these behaviors that apply to the classroom, not caring about what other people think, not putting good effort into their work so that you think that they just don't care about things. And this is really related to children feeling that they're overloaded, they're not monitoring their own behaviors, and they feel really disorganized in their approach to tasks. So all of these things are cognitive skills that really are needed to do executive functioning well. And a lot of the children that we work with just have a reduced skill set, and they also have a reduced ability to perform those skills even when they have them, particularly when they're overwhelmed or overloaded.
And then I think a key issue there is if any of us as adults in a small person's life are mistaking a can't for a won't, we don't actually have a lot we can do, right? And this helps sometimes to think about a more obvious kind of learning disability. I would say executive dysfunction creates a learning disability, but we're familiar with things like reading disabilities, right? So if a child can't decode words, they don't have the skill to break down words into phonemes, then you could, take away recess, you could, punish them in other ways, you could try to change their behavior in a bunch of different ways and be totally unsuccessful because you're thinking of it as a refusal, when in fact it's something they can't do, and they're not going to decode until you give them an intervention plan that's designed to teach them, to give them the skill that they're lacking, to turn that can't into a can.
Yeah, so one of my favorite metaphors for this is that it's the idea that when someone can't do it and you're trying to apply this idea that I'm going to motivate them, or I'm going to, try to incentivize them or even punish them. It's like offering people who are drowning money. If you say, like, I'm going to give you $1,000, can you swim now? So if someone is drowning, you can offer them every incentive. It's not going to help in that situation because they don't have the skill and they're overwhelmed. So this is exactly in the situation. If you're dealing with a can't situation and you're trying to apply those contingencies and motivators that tend to work for most students, you may really be hitting the wall because it's not going to work. So when we define flexibility, you see this in the classroom a lot as difficulty transitioning from one activity to another, having trouble with changes in routine, or if a student is expecting to do one thing and the routine changes, or things change because of things that are outside of your control, kids can have trouble with that. Even just seeing more than one way of doing things. And this is particularly challenging for children when you're trying to give them feedback about what they're doing. Even helpful feedback, let alone critical feedback, is that some children have a really difficult time being able to accept that feedback because they're stuck on the one way that they are looking at things. And this is all presents a lot of challenges with flexibility. And it, again, can manifest either in ways that they're thinking, ways that they're behaving in terms of, I can't inhibit behaviors that may be off-putting or inappropriate, and I can't monitor myself. So even though I may know I'm supposed to wait to be called on when I am have something to say, I'm not monitoring myself, and so I'm still blurting out anyway. Or having a tantrum or getting upset with my emotions when I'm frustrated. So I'll let you talk about this quote, Lauren.
Yeah, I find this to be a very powerful statement that a young man made to me actually a long time ago now, almost a decade, because I think it explains what the experience is of having an inflexible brain in a world that expects flexibility. And what he said, and actually we just asked him what he described himself as having Asperger's. So we said, what does that mean to you? And he said, Asperger's is like a vice on your brain, and each unexpected event is like another turn on the vice. It just keeps building until you feel like you're going to explode. Sometimes when you explode, it comes out the wrong way. And I think what's really important about that is he's describing this flexibility demand as a physical torture, right? He's got a metal vice on his head, and it's getting tighter and tighter. And it gives me insight as a person who doesn't have as much flexibility problems into the cost that these kids experience when they're in situations where they have this difficulty with flexibility and it's not recognized or understood. And I think about it like the kids, in a wheelchair, and there's no ramp getting into the school, right? And so this child is crawling up the steps in order to get to class. They are exhausted by the time they get there. They're exhausted by the time they get, home and, to the dinner table. And so for a child like this, it's the wheelchair ramps are the supports that we can provide around flexibility that will make all the difference.
And I realize that we have a lot of slides left, so I'm going to be flexible in this situation and move us on a little faster so we can get through some of these slides. So again, this is some additional examples of what cognitive inflexibility may look like, particularly in your classroom. So again, these can vary by individual children and by circumstances, but a lot of these behaviors that you really may think, gosh, they're so irritating because this kid just won't do what I need him to do in this class, can really be problems with flexibility and therefore their skill-based deficits. So again, accepting feedback, transitioning, just managing themselves and frustrations, starting something that they don't want to do, stopping something that you've told them not to do, and then avoiding either melting down or shutting down when they are overwhelmed, because both of these, if you think about it, are difficulties with regulation. If you completely shut down, you're sort of over-regulating and sucking into yourself. And if you are having a complete meltdown, you're under-regulating. All of your behavior and emotions just sort of are coming out all over because you're not able to regulate them. So this can come out socially too, when kids won't stop correcting others or let other people take the lead in playing or change their ideas of playing. So these are all facets of inflexibility that can manifest in the classroom. In addition, kids with flexibility have problems with planning and organizing. They don't know how to start something that is got multiple steps. So you really have to figure out, help them to identify their goal and to prioritize what's important. So kids tend to focus with flexibility, tend to overly focus on details and they don't see the big picture. So that can be really challenging when you're trying to get them to do a complicated or multi-step assignment. In addition, oh, Lauren, I love the way you explained this. So I want you to talk about the Ray figure, which is next, because it helps us understand a little bit about how brains of kids, when they have this type of executive functioning, manifest.
Yeah, because, you know, Christie and I work at Children's National, and we do neuropsychological evaluations, and parents and sometimes teachers send kids in because they're having problems, often related to these executive functions, in the real world. And we're supposed to figure that out in our quiet, one-to-one office situations where we're an adult supporting a kid. And frankly, your kids look beautiful in that setting. So a lot of the time, there's a lot less of that real world hot executive function demand going on. So we get kind of, you know, we have to get tricky to try to figure out how we can pull for some of these difficulties. And one of the ways we do this is we ask kids to copy this complex figure. And the reason that we use this is because it's new. It's not familiar to the child. It has a lot of information in it, so it's complex. And they have to integrate that information to create the figure, and they have to integrate vision and motor skills when we ask them to copy it. So if we were to ask you to copy that figure, we would expect, and we expect in children, particularly by 12, but developing earlier than 12, to take a kind of a big picture approach. It's too much information to process all piece by piece. So we kind of expect people to go for that underlying rectangle, that big X through it, maybe the horizontal and vertical lines that bisect the rectangle. Then you can add on the triangles and the gugas and the other details. But by taking a big picture approach to that, it makes it much easier to manage all that information. Not unlike what happens when a kid goes onto a playground and sees a whole bunch of kids doing different things, some of whom the child knows well, some of whom have reputations for certain kinds of behavior, others of whom are using a lot of nonverbals and talking loud, or when a child sits down to learn a new skill like long division that they've never encountered before. So in all those cases, when you're dealing with new information and a lot of information, it really helps to be able to stand back and see the forest for the trees. And the next slide just shows you an example of a very bright 9-year-old boy who I've followed all his life. He's now gone to math grad school. He was a math genius when I first saw him, but he was on his teacher's last nerve because he, quote, would not write. And that was sort of one of the reasons he came in to see me. He was also having a lot of social difficulties. And when I gave him the ray, this is what he did. And the different colored pencils tell you the process by which he approached this figure. And what's really interesting is how exquisitely he ignored or didn't take that big picture approach. So he started over there with that green pencil over there on the left side. And then he used the blue pencil. And if you look at that blue triangle in the top left of the figure, Christie, if you go back to the to the figure that he's copying, most of us don't even think of that as a separate part of this figure, right? So for him, if we go back to his figure, we can see he has made that X 6 different lines. You can tell by the colors, right? So he's actually done something much more impressive than what I would have done copying that, because he's gotten all these discrete little parts to come together on this page. But there's a problem with this approach, and you see it in the next slide, where we've taken the figure away and we've asked him to draw what he remembers of what he just copied. And here you can see that when you take this part approach, it can be very difficult to hold on to the information that you have learned in the past and apply it to the current situation, hence that sense that people don't learn from their mistakes sometimes, and also just to take meaning from larger, more complex situations. So we think about this as a more detail-focused kind of approach to information. And I think in the next slide, you can see how that plays out in some behaviors that can look like can'ts, that can look like won'ts, like they're refusing to do things, but really underneath reflect this different cognitive approach that make it a can't. And so in this little boy's case, he was quote unquote refusing to write because to write was really hard for him. He had fine motor problems, but also to get that big picture of a paragraph that he could put together to express his good ideas, that was quite difficult. But we also see things like disorganized language. We see children who don't set goals, don't relate, the fact that they want to be a doctor to the fact that they better do their homework tonight in order to become that doctor, need lots of structure in new situations, and have trouble drawing meaning from what they read. So there's a lot of different examples here, but you can see in each case, these are behaviors that you might look at and think that kid isn't trying, and it could be the case. All kids, as well as adults, have our moments when we just downright refuse. But you can also question, could this be an underlying executive function problem? Is there a can't here that we could either support or remediate? So we've given you that big picture of sort of the importance of understanding what you're dealing with. And we've just talked about a couple examples of flexibility and organization and planning, partly because those are a big part of Unstuck. But just because we don't have a lot of time, we're going to jump ahead and let me just ask, how much more time do we have?
Not so much, I don't think.
Michelle?
So, I would say we have as much time as you want, but ideally, if we can be able to be jumping into Q&A by 8:30, that would be fantastic.
Oh, we can definitely do that. We'll even try to do a little better than that. Christie and I can talk really fast when we get go. Okay, so we're now jumping to the second thing. If we understand the problem, then the next step, before we get to move about like fixing the problem, is we need to provide accommodations. Remember that little girl in the wheelchair. She needs a ramp to get into school, excuse me, before we start working on teaching her new skills. So it's very important that we accommodate before we try to remediate or teach. And the first reason for that is that it's actually neurodiversity, the idea of different kinds of brains, different kinds of approaches to information, that represents kind of a new horizon of civil rights, right? And just as we know that every person, regardless of their color, their race, their ethnicity, adds to our culture, so do different kinds of brains add to our culture. They will bring new skills, they'll bring new ideas. We just have to make sure that we make things accessible. So it's a civil right, and we want to recognize that. But there's this other fact, which is overwhelmed people can't learn. And you heard Christie talking about how easy it is for these things to pile up on a kid and for them to fall into a situation where they really can't process information further. So we like to talk about kind of 6 key accommodations for kids who struggle with flexibility, organization, and planning, and the fact that those need to be in place before we talk about intervention. And we've already talked about one of them, and that's just to understand where things are breaking down and to make sure that we're not attributing behaviors to choices or won'ts that maybe can't. The second thing that's really important is predictability and structure. And I think we can move on. And just say that when you have an inflexible brain, one of the things that you're at risk for, one of the things that happens more easily, is that you have trouble when your expectations are violated. Like, let's just say maybe COVID, which every day is leading to these unexpected and different kinds of situations. So what you think is going to happen in September, you know, where you might be going back to school, doesn't happen. What you think is going to happen on a normal Sunday, where maybe you go to a place of worship, doesn't happen. Nothing is going as it should. And so when we think about kids who are inflexible, this is a real problem for them. But there's some key accommodations, I think you click ahead there, that we can do to provide them with a little bit of support in these uncertain times. Written down schedules, routines, predicting change in advance, and almost always the most fundamental accommodation is flexibility in the adults who work with the kid. Another thing that happens, I don't know, Christie, do you want to talk about this one, is getting stuck on overwhelming, intense feelings?
Yeah. So we know that kids with flexibility problems can really churn around in big feelings. And this really can, become a vicious cycle, because kids that get upset, when you think that they should be able to calm themselves down, they work themselves up. And this makes it impossible to problem solve well. So we talked about that idea of the drowning person and trying to motivate them in that situation. You're going to be unsuccessful because you can't, that's not a motivational situation. It's a situation of overwhelm and distress. And so when you think about that, you need to bring that temperature down for a child who's overwhelmed. An accommodation that you can do is to kind of give them a safe out, and again, be flexible. I think the temptation when you have a child that is being inflexible is to, we're told this, right, is to be stricter, to make the rules more explicit, that I'm just going to be more rigid with my approach, because if I waver or if I give in, that's just going to make the problem worse. We're taught this a lot, but really what you're trying to do for these children is to model flexibility, is to show that you can be flexible also, because you're teaching them how when they don't know. If you are matching their inflexibility with your own, it's going to be extremely difficult for them to learn, and you end up with more overwhelm. This is that cycle that we were just talking about. If you have the inflexible child and you meet that inflexibility with saying, oh no, this was the rule, this was the expectation, we told you that the homework would be due, we told you that if you forgot to bring your pencil, you would get a 0 for the assignment. This inflexibility, even though it is very important to establish rules and it's very important to follow through with them much of the time, when you've got a child that is going to respond to that inflexibility with more inflexibility instead of less, who is really incapable of taking that feedback and turning it into a positive behavior like many children can, you are going to end up with even more inflexibility. And what that does is it tends to make us mad. So, as adults, we tend to respond to inflexible behavior in our children with getting irritated, because it can be irritating. And so if you don't take the time and effort to say, wait a minute, this child is in distress and needs my help. And again, to me, I always think about it as if this child were having a medical problem in front of me, and if you had a child who was diabetic and was having a low blood sugar reaction, you wouldn't sit there and say like, well, you need to fix yourself right now. I told you that if you didn't have a snack, this is what would happen. And so now what are you going to do about it? You have to be able to be flexible and realize that if there's a child who's overwhelmed and in crisis, and probably the best way to go forward for this particular child is to be flexible and model that flexibility to help them regulate. And the piece that we're talking about here is that there are lots of different things that can happen with the other side of the coin for children that can have some cognitive inflexibility. The great thing is that these are often experts in the one area that they're really excited about. And so you can find and harness those areas of strength to help them feel good about the skills that they do have. A lot of these kids, when they're locked into something, will be incredibly persistent. They like schedules and routines, so they can be really reliable in this way. Sometimes they're too reliable. If they tell you, hey, it's time to do this, but they can keep you on schedule. They can be extremely loyal. And again, some parts of being inflexible helps us adapt to our environment, or helps us make our environment so that it's less overwhelming and overloading. So what we say as an accommodation is that sometimes you're going to have a kid who's inflexible, who has some routines that maybe are a little quirky, but if they don't get in the way of what either the student needs to do or what you need to do, you might not understand them, but you can say, I'm just going to let that routine lie because this has some importance or salience to the student, and it's not interfering with her ability to learn or my ability to teach. So I'm just going to let those go. Lauren, do you want to, take over?
Yeah, so another key accommodation for the kids who have problems with that big picture thinking is to make the big picture explicit. And here we think about, on the next slide, the risks for kids who are more disorganized. And one of them is the trouble they have generalizing knowledge. So here's a parent a real parent in a focus group saying, my daughter can peel a potato, but she can't peel a sweet potato because they're not the same thing. So this kind of difficulty learning from one situation and applying it to the next is something that is common in kids who have that thinking disorganization, not just the disorganization with things, but with thinking. And there are accommodations that can help with that. And some of them involve just explicitly putting information into a familiar context, peeling back inferences and nuances and saying, what do we think we're talking about here? What does this mean? And teaching in the setting where the skill is expected, which is why parents and teachers are fundamental for teaching executive functions. As much as, Christy and I would like to help people in our nice, quiet offices, it's pretty hard to take what you learn there back into the real world. So this idea of trying to help people in the setting in which they're struggling to see the big picture is fundamental. And we use this idea of goals and this word goals to help signal the kids that we're now thinking about that big picture activity. Disorganization also shows up often for kids having difficulty showing what they know. This is really frustrating for teachers and for parents, and it leads people, all of us, to think that a child's holding something back or won't do something because we know that they have knowledge they're not acting on or writing about or showing on a test. So a teacher speaking of a student who has a truly encyclopedic knowledge, but I never see it in his work. For these kids, we want to test, could this be a can't? Is there a problem that he's having or she's having in pulling up that knowledge that they have? And in this case, providing more structured study guides, closed format, like multiple choice tests, writing rubrics, adding structure should help them to retrieve that knowledge. And if it does, then you realize that is, in fact, an area where the thinking organization problems are creating a can't, and they need that accommodation to show their knowledge. And again, just with inflexibility, we want to also recognize the strengths that can come with this kind of thinking and build on those strengths. So these can be kids who are good at following and using rules. They can be very good at following recipes, or they can be much more effective if they have a checklist or a routine. So a kid who can't clean up their room until you pull out a whiteboard and you write down 3 things on it. Pick up all the clothes, right? Put the books and toys on the shelf, and make your bed. And then the kid can go in and do 1, 2, 3 in a way that they really couldn't when you just said clean up your room. That you're now leveraging their detail processor strengths to help them be successful. Another key accommodation that us adults have a lot of trouble with is we need to talk less. We can write more often than we can talk, and we can write or we can draw pictures. And by the way, all these accommodations, the reason that little book is up there in the top right-hand corner is because they're all described in detail in that book, as well as in the online training. But for many kids with the executive dysfunction and these disorganized thinking and poor planning skills, getting a whiteboard, using stickies, doing something so that when you want to give them a direction or you want to help them understand what just went wrong in an interaction, you are doing it with a static visual cue is fundamental. And it will quickly change some children's responses to what's happening. So the example that I always think of here is I observed in a school for kids with very severe flexibility problems, most on the autism spectrum, a teacher who did a really good job of providing visual cues and laying out for the students how she wanted them to write one of those paragraphs to persuade that kids are always asked to write, and then they do like they write a paragraph about how pizza should be in the cafeteria every day of the week, or recess should be twice as long. And in any case, she laid this out quite nicely. 5 of the 6 kids in this little classroom got right to work. The 6th kid leaned back in his chair and didn't do anything. And she came up to him and she said, "I'd like you to get started. You see the directions up there on the board." And he sits back, not doing it. And she says, "No, really, I want you to be able to leave and go outside for recess, 15 minutes. Everybody else is working on this. Let's see if you can get it done." "Nope, not doing it." At that point, she turned away, which was actually a very smart thing to do. Because if you think about what Christie was just talking about with the inflexible child and the inflexible adult, what does that make for? It makes for power struggles. And she's starting to get into a power struggle with this kid. And she's opting out. She turns away. She's going to come up with a new strategy. I'm right with her. I'm thinking, I know exactly where you're going, Miss Teacher. And then she comes back with a whiteboard. And even though I've been for years saying to people, you need to write it down, I was really shocked by what I saw, because she took the whiteboard out and she wrote exactly what she just said. "I need you to get started." She handed the whiteboard and the dry erase pen to the child. The child wrote, "My pencil is broken." So what happened there? The child had a difficulty. The child was stuck and unable to problem solve with that difficulty. And certainly in this case, and this child did have social challenges as well, he was unable to process what she was saying. Her face was in his face at that moment to come up with a response to move forward. He needed the space. He needed to reduce the processing load by not having to do the auditory piece, but being able to read at his own pace. And at that point, he could then respond appropriately. So that's my talk less, write more story. And that's a key accommodation. Keep it positive. Now, this is definitely Dr. Hardy's wheelhouse. I think the next one will show you the praise correction ratio, the most evidence-based thing in psychology, right, Christie?
Yeah, keeping it positive is something that can be challenging when you feel like you're being frustrated yourself, or if you're really getting a child that's inflexible and is also putting some of that negativity out into the world and onto you. It can be really difficult. But we know that, as Dr. Kenworthy said, one of the most evidence-based interventions is simply telling kids, giving them praise, and helping them understand that you acknowledge or you understand what they're doing correct. So what do we say about this? For every correction or command or negative incidents of feedback that you need to give them, you should be giving them 4 elements of praise, 4 things that they're doing right. This is incredibly important for children who have executive functioning challenges for a couple reasons. One, they're going to get more negativity. And we know that just like if you had somebody who was constantly giving you negative or comments or criticisms, you would come to expect those negative comments or criticisms. And you're also going to start to feel negative about any interaction with that person, because you're going to feel terrible. You're like, when is it coming? I'm going to get another criticism. I'm going to get another correction. And you start to expect them. And you also start to say, I'm not sure I can do anything right in this situation because I get so many. But second, kids by their nature who have executive function problems often are poor at self-monitoring. So they actually might not notice or understand when they are doing something that is correct that you want them to see. So if you know, I always think of the ADHD kid who's like twiddling his pen back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And, and you notice that he's actually sitting quietly and has not blurted out. And so you're saying, great job, Jacob. And he's like, yeah, man, I learned to like twist it through my hand for the 4th time. And so he may not understand if you don't say, Jacob, I love the way that you're sitting quietly or that you're waiting to talk. And so you really need to give that praise, and it needs to be very specific, because kids may not pay attention to the things that you think are important about what their behavior is doing. And it helps to balance out some of that correction or criticisms or commands that you're giving them, the corrective feedback that they need to learn, and balance it out with a lot of positives.
Just to say, that's really hard.
It is really hard.
Just try it on the day that you're the calmest and most collected. Try marking on one hand every praise and on the other every correction, and go for 4 to 1. I finally achieved it on a Saturday afternoon when I had had a good long time to relax in my own household, and I could work through that. But it's not easy, but boy, is it powerful. All of these accommodations come together to help avoid overload. And I think that that's kind of what Christie was talking about at the beginning. If when you have executive dysfunction, things can kind of pile on, and you're much more likely to become overwhelmed. And at that point, kids tend to either shut down. I think maybe does the next slide show this? We have our curve here. Oh, no, it's the safe address one. Okay. So, but when you get overloaded, kids tend to shut down or melt down. And in both cases, they really struggle to be effective. This StoryCorps, I think, might be worth taking the time to play, just because I don't know about you guys, but I feel like there's a lot of really bad news these days. And I find StoryCorps very comforting. It's this Library of Congress process where 2 people go into an audio booth and record something that they've shared. And in this case, these 2 people are talking about how David on the right helped Russell. And can we play it, Christie? Will people be able to hear it?
Let me see. Oops, did it stop?
And it's time for StoryCorps now. Air travel can be stressful for all of us, but for Russell Lehman, who has autism, a flight delay or cancellation is not just inconvenient. Unexpected changes can cause him to have panic attacks or worse. And that's what happened recently when Russell was trying to catch a flight from his hometown of Reno to Cincinnati. At StoryCorps, he sat down with David Abkarian, an airline employee, to remember that painful moment.
I remember sitting in the same exact spot for 7 hours, crying, and not one person made eye contact with me. The next day, once again, my flight was delayed, and that's when I found an empty ticket counter. I sat behind it, and I started sweating bullets, rocking back and forth, hyperventilating. I haven't had an episode like that probably since I was like 11, and that's when you came up.
We were sitting on the floor, and you looked really upset. Do you remember what I first said?
I don't remember a whole lot, because for me, in the midst of a meltdown, my brain literally feels like it's on fire with a vice grip around it, just getting tighter and tighter. I have a hard time comprehending the simplest sentences. I feel like I'm on a planet all by myself. But when you crouched down beside me and asked me what was going on, my feelings started to change. Having someone actually recognize that I was human and that I was there, it meant the world to me. I didn't feel as fragile. I had someone on my team.
I remember letting the crew know that you were very uneasy about getting on the airplane, and I brought the captain over to hopefully
give you another boost of confidence. Yeah, that's when I made up my mind. Yeah, I'm getting on this plane. You walked me onto the flight. I was able to board before anybody else to get situated and just kind of have some peace. So David, did you wonder what happened to me after I finally got on the plane?
Yeah, it's actually funny you should ask that. I have access to our computer system at home, and I followed you. I saw that second flight did have a little bit of a delay, but it showed that you had stayed on board and got through. I was very happy about that.
You didn't really know much about autism that day in the airport, but you connected on a human level, and we can't lose in that situation. What you did really changed my life. Knowing that since this was such a difficult meltdown and one of the worst I've ever had, that since I got through that, I can pretty much get through anything.
That was Russell Lehman and David Opkarian at StoryCorps in Reno. Their conversation will be archived at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Oops. Sorry, guys. I played it again. I'll just go on to the next slide.
So the reason I think that StoryCorps is so powerful is because it encapsulates the experience of becoming overwhelmed and overloaded, in this case by unexpected events and delayed flights, but also the power of the adult who understands, doesn't judge, and pulls back. He's not jumping in there and telling him to get out from under the counter. He's getting him on the plane early. He's providing accommodations, and he's seeing him as a human being in distress, just like Christie was talking about, our drowning person, and providing the supports that he needs to succeed. And that, to me, is the best of what we do when we understand people for what they're going through at the moment and provide those supports. And when we do that, when we have people, and a safe address, by the way, is a very powerful thing for a child at school, in a family, at church, anywhere. It's one person who knows and understands that child and likes them, and who the child trusts. Because one of the things that can help the most to provide structure, to provide predictability, to provide big picture explicit thinking is an adult who kind of can help stabilize that child and give them the support that they need at that moment. Once those things are in place, once we have adults who understand how to work with kids, the right kinds of supports in place, then we think about teaching executive function skills. Because we know that our children will grow up. We know that they need to go out into the world and they need to be able to function as effectively as possible in settings where there won't necessarily be those accommodations in place. And for that, we think about, how are we going to teach this kid to fish, right? We understand the issues, we're accommodating the problems, now we're going to teach the new skills. And right now, I don't know about you, but in my house, the whole idea of learning anything new feels a little bit like this kid right here, right? 35-mile-an-hour zone. I think that's reading 99 miles. There's the kid stuck to the windshield. It's just such a crazy, overwhelming time for all of us. I think it's important to recognize that it's not just kids who need some accommodations, some understanding, and some support. And if you are not on your very best behavior in a Zoom classroom or in a nighttime routine, join the club. We're all there. We're just going to give you a few pointers for the things to do at your best of times to help build executive functions in kids. Do you want to talk about the feelings target, Christie, or would you rather I do?
It doesn't matter. I can. So it's one of the big things is, even though this sounds really simple, is to help kids understand what emotion they're feeling and what the intensity of that feeling is. Because kids, believe it or not, don't always or can't always name what they're feeling. And in fact, if they're feeling overloaded or negative, they may have a real hard time telling you about what exactly that process is. And And so if kids can more accurately identify their feeling and kind of point to, I'm having a really intense feeling, they can tend to make better choices about what to do next. So in the Unstuck curriculum, one of the early is teaching kids to kind of self-identify their just right feeling, which is sort of this green area in the center, and then progressive states where they are far from just right. And it's important to know that there are some kids who are going to be able to tell you exactly the way they feel. I'm frustrated, or I'm overwhelmed, or I'm scared, or I'm upset, or I'm angry. But other kids are just going to know that they don't feel right. And so having this flexibility of a feelings target, meaning I want to be in this just right place where I may not be able to exactly tell you how or why I'm feeling just right. I just know that it's the good place for me, and that's what I'd like to feel, versus the place out here where it's all bad and I'm overwhelmed and I don't know what to say. So as adults, we can guide them and help them try to understand their feelings, but at an experiential level, kids don't always need to have the precise language to tell you exactly what they're feeling. But if they can tell you, yeah, I'm at just right, or I'm at a 3, I'm feeling upset, I'm feeling not okay, and we know that for this child, as they progress out of here, that they are going to feel increasingly overwhelmed, and that their behavior and their cognitions will follow. This is something that is important for us to know, so that we can help guide them and help them understand that they want to be moving this way in the feelings wheel, the feelings target, instead of this way. So
what we find is that this can be a visual cue. In the trial, we had schools and parents come and say, you know, I'd like a whole bunch of little feelings targets. So we started printing them out, you know, so that a teacher has it, a therapist has it, the parent has it. The parent can use it on the parent's spouse when needed. You know, we all need times when we just remind ourselves to get centered and to think, how am I doing right now? And this becomes quite contagious. So you will hear kids, when you start to get this as sort of a culture or a common vocabulary in a school setting, saying to each other, you know, I'm a 3, I need to take some deep breaths. And they start to talk that way, and this can happen in families as well. And it's kind of a precursor to working on those flexibility skills.
Oops.
Which come next.
Oh, yeah.
So, and it's the first piece of common language that's really at the core of what we're doing in Unstuck. And what we're doing is we're teaching kids self-regulatory scripts, things that they can say to themselves, very brief words that you can say to them when they need to start to calm down to avoid an overload situation, where you don't get into too much talking, right? It isn't the Ginger situation, a blah, blah, blah kind of thing, where you bring them back to the big picture of some ideas that they've learned in calmer times, in an Unstuck group or in other kinds of therapy settings. And some of these scripts are on the next page. The ones that we use in Unstuck that become a shared and an automatic vocabulary for kids and parents and teachers are really simple: flexible, unstuck, compromise. Compromise is actually pretty hard for adults because we forget that compromise means we both get some of what we want, even if one of us is smaller than the other one. Plan A, plan B. Big deal, little deal. Again, as long as we don't use big deal, little deal to say, oh, that's just a little deal when a kid is feeling upset, that's invalidating their feelings. But we can always say, how can we make this big deal into a little deal and problem solve with the child? And all of those scripts, and we'll give you some examples in a minute, can be used to help children in those moments of disappointment, in those moments of unexpected events, in, you know, like every day these days, where things are going in strange directions, to help them manage their feelings and to regulate their thinking when they need to be flexible. Goal, why, plan, do, check is a universal script, we would say, for getting a multiple step task done. We're using it tonight to get through these slides, although we're not doing a great job, as Christie pointed out, of doing it in a timely way. We are at least sticking with the routine.
We're almost done.
So, but all of this is language that can become shared in a classroom, in a home, in a therapy setting. And ideally, for the inflexible brain, everybody's using the same words. So the next slides, I think, just have a couple different examples. This is a teacher using the term goal, compromise, plan, do, and check with a student to work out a situation at the end of school where the teacher wants the child to get ready to go to the bus, but the child wants to play kickball. So they work out a compromise, they have a plan, and they then are going to follow through on that plan. I think maybe we've got some more of these, Christie. What's next? These are just examples from the Solving Executive Function Challenges books. They're also in the online training modules of sort of how you just build this language into your life. Like, how do I just talk about this when I'm talking to my spouse, when I'm figuring out how to navigate a traffic jam? How do I use these words to ask my child for help? Because they love to help us to become more flexible, calm, and focused.
Right. And I think that this is a really good place to model these skills when you can use it in your own life, because we talked about hot executive functions where kids are trying to problem solve under conditions of emotional salience. When you can explain to them, when you're trying to do these yourselves, it's not usually emotionally salient for the child. It may be for you. But if you say, you know, you come home from work and you say, well, I forgot to take the chicken out of the freezer, and that was my plan A for dinner. And now I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm just kind of, you know, I'm tired. My brain's not helping me think about things. You can go to the child and say, can you help me think of a plan B? Or can you help me think of what we can do? Because the child will be more readily able to engage you in the problem solving when it's not his problem. And now if your kid's the one that is like saying, I'm about to melt down unless I have some food, that may not be the greatest example. But usually kids are really excited to help us problem solve. And what you're doing is you are engaging them in the task. You're modeling them that this is actually the same process. This is not just for you that we're doing plan A, plan B. This is what I do too. And it's actually helpful. And it also creates a lot of times where you can give them a lot of praise. So you can do this in the classroom, you can do it at home, and you can model those skills in situations that are low stakes for the student so that they learn the model, the script, and it becomes a little bit more automatic for them so that they're more likely to be able to be receptive to engaging in that process when they are starting to get overwhelmed, but also more successful with it because they're familiar.
So I know there was a request for some IEP goals. How do you write this into an IEP? And actually the book Solving Executive Function Challenging has a whole appendix with IEP goals in it. That's what it is at the back. And these are just some of them from the book. But I would just draw a couple sort of points around these. One is that I like to write IEP goals that start with what needs to be provided. Remember, accommodate before you try to remediate. So with fading adult supports, Jamal's going to use a structured recipe. He needs those adult supports. Nobody learns executive functions the way they learn long division. You need to practice it repeatedly, and you need to have adults in there cueing you, just like you think about when you teach a kid to ride a bike or to play soccer or to sing a scale. You know, if you're a musician, there's situations where adults are there, they explain, they show, they support the process, they correct, you go over and over again. That's the way you need to teach executive functions. So with those fading adult supports, or given concrete training and visual supports, and then faded adult cueing, Jamal's going to correctly label flexible behaviors. I think the principle is just you want to sort of put that piece first, and then you can be very specific about the self-regulatory scripts you want the child to learn to use, the structured routines or recipes, the appropriate response to, again, previewing when there's going to be a transition, not just landing a transition on a kid with no warning, but saying, if we give Jamal a couple warnings, then we will expect him to be able to initiate a new activity. So I think the next slide might just show some of these tools we've been talking about. So the Unstuck and On-Target curriculum that we revised at Christie's recommendation to include kids with all kinds of executive function challenges is that green book there in the top right. That is used when you have a small group of kids, or like people like Christie do it one-on-one in therapy sessions, but it's not typically used by teachers or parents unless you're really desperate in time of COVID and doing a homeschooling pod. You could use some of the activities. But the parent and teacher book we've talked a lot about, and then at the bottom is the link to the online parent training modules. Now, what we're also doing right now, and I'm so excited to be working with Christie again on this, is we are developing online training for teachers and also a set of free little videos for parents to help them to just implement little bits of Unstuck. So that's like, they're going to be 3 to 5 minute long videos. You can just look at them quickly, and then you can kind of maybe get a little bit of a boost in your day to think about how you're going to support executive functions. Those are going to, we're just developing them now. We went over the first script yesterday. Yeah. So we're hoping that they will be coming available around Thanksgiving. And if it's okay with this, with SEPTA, we'll let you know when they're available, because they'll be distributed through Fairfax and Arlington and Loudoun County Public Schools. So if your child has an IEP and has a special educator that you're engaged with, it's something you could request from that special educator. Again, probably more towards winter for us to get those rolling, but we're really excited about those. I love that we get to give those away. That's good. We also want to let you know that this curriculum has been spiraled upward for middle and high school. A middle school trial of On-Target for Life was successful in Fairfax last year. And Cara Pugliese, who's developed the high school version, just got a big NIMH grant and will be running another big trial of Flexible Futures. And the nice thing about this is, you know, just like math or writing, you don't just teach executive functions once in a child's life, but you get to come back to it as they encounter new challenges. And these interventions are consistent in their use of these common vocabularies. I think we just have people to thank, maybe? Yes, always people to thank. More people than we can think of, but there's a few. And then the next slide will just show you, Unstuck was written by a group, a multidisciplinary group. Lynn Cannon is a teacher, Laura Anthony, psychologist, Katie Alexander, occupational therapist, Monica Werner, a counselor, and myself. I think that's it, right, Christie?
That is it. That's the end of the slideshow.
Fantastic. Thank you. We have a lot of questions for you. So I'll try to summarize them and move through them. And thank you, especially for including the IEP pieces as well, because that's definitely something that was coming up in the questions and something that parents are eager to know about. Would it be possible actually to share the slides with our membership after the presentation?
Yes. Yeah, we'll just take out that Ray, because we're not supposed to pass that around to people, and I'll send them to you.
Terrific, thank you.
As a Dropbox link, will that work?
I'm sure we'll figure it out afterwards, but people are asking if they can see the slides again later. How often should the program be implemented for kids for it to have a real effect? From what I was hearing you saying, it's really a matter of teaching the language. Is it a certain number of days a week or minutes a day that you would recommend?
You know, it's interesting. The dose is relatively low. That when we showed that it was effective, it was usually one of those small groups a week that was happening in the public schools, usually about 45 minutes a week. The key is that it becomes, as we've said, adopted by everybody in the child's life. So the small group introduces the principles and fun activities, but then they need to hear it from the teacher. That feelings target needs to be on their desk. It needs to be at home on the fridge, and the language has to be used broadly. But we were effective with that, 21 about 45-minute group sessions.
And it sounds like every teacher really is going to have a student who needs this, or most likely has already had a student who needs it. You started to mention about the teacher training. Do you have tips or suggestions on how parents can help staff understand some of the ideas behind Unstuck?
That's a hard one. I think Christie has to answer that one.
So helping to disseminate this to teachers. Am I unmuted
Yes.
now? Yeah, I mean, it is hard because, listen, I think every kid could benefit from examining, or from using some of these flexibility tools. We know that developing flexibility as a skill isn't just particularly challenging for a few students in the classroom. It can be challenging for everybody at a different time. So to me, if it were up to me, and clearly it isn't, I would be saying that these should be skills that you can very easily roll into your classroom structure and your routine, your classroom rules, and talk about it in that way. Because just like you have to teach kids explicitly about some organization and planning skills. You have to teach them what it means to check their work. You're teaching process, right, half the time that you're teaching content. And so to me, this is one of the process pieces that you can help your students to learn, because you're really teaching them an element of problem solving that is incredibly critical for them to face challenges. And I think this really fits into a lot of the conversations that we're having around the idea of grit and perseverance. And I think that conversation really is filtering its way into mainline curriculums and mainstream things. We're talking about mindfulness and making that available to as a classroom-wide intervention. And I really think that this flexibility piece can be very well understood within that context, and can really be something that is not all that difficult to put in. Again, I use it all the time with the children and families that I work with, but I also use it in my house. And once you start practicing that, it really does. And I use it with myself all the time. I'm like, okay, what's my plan B? Or I say, how can I turn this big deal into a little deal? Because when you practice that flexibility and you can kind of manage and regulate in yourself and help your colleagues and students, everybody is just kind of functions a little bit better. And I think that everybody has been had to have the expectations for flexibility kicked up about 17 notches during COVID. So it's a really good time to be introducing those skills and talking about them.
Absolutely. So I can speak from personal experience on how to get this type of information into your kid's IEP. Like you had shown the sample goals, you can absolutely push to have included the underlying skills that go with this. And while I haven't found that a school is going to say in the IEP, the child will use Unstuck and On-Target to blah, blah, blah. You can absolutely have them say, the child will use an executive functioning program, and then like in parentheses, such as Unstuck and On-Target. So even though you can't strong arm the school into using it, you can, as a parent, go in and request goals that really work on these skills. Looking also at your questions, how do you handle it when other people seem to really view the modeling flexibility as coddling or not teaching discipline? It's sort of, to me, like old school versus new school.
Well, I can always say that I think that I usually tell people who worry about, like, well, aren't you bribing kids to do the things that they should do? And I always say bribing is inducement for bad behavior. And you really want kids to, you're really trying to encourage good behavior. And we do that in a lot of different ways. I know that, we want people to just do what they should do and do the right thing no matter what. And we expect that, to me, that seems to imply that everyone should be at the same level all the time. And we simply know that that's not true with regard to learning. And we accept that, right? Some kids are more advanced in some skills. They learn reading quicker. They acquire their math facts. They're better writers. And we accept that variability. But where we struggle some is that there is also variability in learning some of those behavior and cognitive regulation skills. And so applying the same behavioral expectation would be a silly quickly as applying the same learning expectation for everybody and saying, well, everyone should be at the exact same level all the time, and I should have to do nothing different to teach reading to the 30 different kids in my class. So when you view this as a skill that has a lot of different variability in where people are at their starting points, then it's less coddling. Would you say that you would be coddling a kid with dyslexia by giving them extra support when they needed it? I think most teachers would say, no, you have to do that in order to see them progress. And so this is how I view that as well.
I think that sometimes the polite version of hitting them on the head with a 2x4 can be a pretty strong approach as well. We have some questions about age for this resource to be used for kids. My sense is that you can really start introducing this language very, very early. Do you have any minimum age that you would recommend starting with?
Lauren, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, because I actually used this in my son's preschool. My son did a co-op kind of preschool, so I was in there, and you know, there the big deal is circle time, and I want to sit next to Sammy, but Sammy's sitting next to Felicia, and now what am I going to do? And so if then that child was, you know, would compromise and sit next to Susie, I'd just take masking tape and write flexible and put it on their chest, and they'd walk around all day like, I'm flexible. You know, they are very responsive to positive feedback like that, and the language becomes very contagious. So in some of the Fairfax County Public Schools where we ran the second trial, where it was really exciting, the principal kind of took it on as, we're going to make this common language, and counselors, they didn't do the whole Unstuck, but they pushed in because they'd show up in kindergarten kind of to teach kids to be good citizens, and they'd push in some of the vocabulary there and put whole lessons together. So definitely preschool and kindergarten, you can start that kind of language. Probably not goal, why, plan, do, check so much as some of the flexibility scripts.
Right. And the feelings wheel, like the feelings target is another thing where I think if you get that on board early, again, especially if you're just sort of talking about kids or how close to you or just right are you, kids can start getting that idea really quickly, and learning to label that and learning to monitor and label those feelings when they're building is really key to helping manage them.
And I think that a lot of your program, you find similar pieces of it in other programs like Zones of Regulation and I'm drawing a blank, you know, like how does your engine run? Those, yep, and Superflex, all those types of things. Yeah. Any significant strengths to this program that would be, you know, big selling points for parents to push for? My sense is really the language of the program, but what do you think?
Yeah. So first of all, if a child has adopted a certain language, like how does your engine run, they don't have to do the feelings target, right? Like we're all about just getting them to the end point. So, but that shared common language is fundamental. And just like you said, Michelle, I think there's several different ways to do this in school settings with interventions around emotion awareness and coping skills. There's less this is really a neuropsychologically driven focus on these self-regulatory executive function skills. And I think, I don't think the other packages do that as effectively. But again, you know, if something's working, go with it.
Absolutely. I hear you on that. A more specific question, how do you provide breaks for students who are upset that they're behind because they feel like they're then going to fall more behind? So how do you set them up for success with taking breaks?
Christie, do you have thoughts, or do you want me to dive in?
Yeah, I mean, either way, I think of that as like a big deal, little deal. It's a real fundamental problem because it's having that problem with the forest through the trees. And I think most of this is sort of anticipating that problem for a student. So you're really, and I think of this very neuropsychologically, as Lauren just said, when you start to get overwhelmed, your problem solving abilities actually get worse. And I think most of us know that, because when we get frustrated and overwhelmed, it's just harder to think clearly. And so a lot of keeping these skills on board and problem solving has to happen before the overwhelm sets in. So again, it's like offering money to a drowning person. If you're trying to problem solve after the person's already overwhelmed and in a panic, you're going to get less there. So what I usually say is, when we're starting, what's our plan going to be if you don't finish by the time we need to transition to our next activity? How are we going to feel good about stopping this if you didn't get it all done? What's our plan going to be? Because then you're presetting the idea that maybe a break will be needed, and how will I know when that break is, and what is my plan B going to be to make myself feel good if I don't finish this exactly? So it's going to be about that, and it really is helping the child understand, like, I think your challenge in this situation is going to be stopping this activity if you don't finish it all. What do you think? And how can we solve that problem? What's going to be our plan if we notice that happens? And again, you're trying to be that safe person. You're setting yourself up to be a partner instead of and now I'm going to be on top of you and say, why didn't you finish your work? We're going to partner through this, and that it can be a lot of an effective way to get in there. I don't know, Lauren, would you have anything to add?
No, I wouldn't. The only other thing to think about there is, even elementary school kids can get engaged in experiments. And just like they can experiment with different kinds of coping strategies and see what works for them, you can say, let's try this out. How does it go for you? How's your afternoon go for you if you get a break? And everybody learns at that point.
Absolutely so. And with the questions also, we've had multiple questions about how do I get the staff to understand this? I think that because we as parents are doing so much more of this primary educating, or at least primary coaching on the executive functioning skills, to be able to observe examples of you at home implementing some of these strategies, and then sending those to the teachers, whether it's you make a little recording of a conversation with your child, or you send them an email describing how you set your child up for success, and then how you actually implemented, for example, that break. And then the teacher says, wow, that's great. I'm so glad that worked. And then you say, yes, and I got it from Unstuck and On-Target. And so it's another way of kind of, getting it in with the staff that this is something that is really helpful, and you're not just making it up as the parent also.
That's a great idea. And I just want to add there, Fairfax County has partnered with us since 2012 on developing Unstuck. So it's not that every teacher, is exposed to it, but in the central office, there's a commitment to supporting Unstuck. So the advantage of it, maybe over some other interventions, is that if you can say, look, this works with my kid, just like you were saying, Michelle, they can get the resources, they can get the kit, they can get the training, those things. And they'll be actively involved in these upcoming projects we're having of disseminating the parent videos and also the teacher trainings.
And somebody put in the YouTube chat also that they contacted central office once the school decided to use Unstuck and On-Target, and central office actually sent the parent a copy of the book. So, the resource is definitely there. I can speak from personal experience that when I knew this was a program that was right for my child, and I pushed our school staff, her teacher was not trained in it. And I said, it's not that hard. You can do this. And she was literally one lesson ahead of my child. And she loved getting the opportunity to learn it. And so, sometimes you just need to just be one page ahead of the kid, and you learn as you go. Any other pieces in terms of distance learning and how parents can support their learners? I know it's kind of a broad question, but we have a lot of parents at home who are really struggling with their kids' struggles.
Yeah, I will just say this because I feel like I've got several kids that I'm working with now where they really are struggling with online curriculum, and parents are frustrated as well. And this is really hard to kind of feel like you're starting the school year out, and when you usually get a little bit of a honeymoon period, and instead it's really stressful. So here's what I would say. I would say really ask for flexibility with your staff, your support staff, and with yourself. Because, and I know we've been talking about flexibility, so I don't want this to sound pat or anything, but you know, I think the recognition that everybody is making it up at this point. So to regard all of the schedules, routines, and things, activities that are up as just sort of, this is our first pass, and we all are going to see how it goes, because this is not regular, you know, circumstances for anyone at this point. And so if you have something that is not working for your child, don't let 4 weeks go by where everybody is getting more and more frustrated. Yes, you probably know your kid well enough to know that this is either just an adjustment or this is a disaster. And if your sense is this is not going to work with my kid, then you should be having that conversation with his or her education team now, and say, you know what? So for example, I've had some kids where it's like specials are sort of a disaster over, you know, and just by saying, can we maybe just not do specials and have my kid have a break during that time? That has done a really, and again, I think that some people are going to be inflexible about that, but if you say, what is our goal here? What is our goal here for my student, for my child? And if we really want him to be able to have a great experience and not to fall behind in, say, math, is it okay if we don't do the online PE class on Wednesdays? Because what can happen then is he can take a little bit of a break and be ready for writing. And so I think asking for that flexibility and again, framing it as like, let's see if it's an experiment that we can try, then that is something that is, I think, potentially really helpful. And I don't think parents should wait to see if things get better on their own.
I think also that when you have some of these pieces, like taking a break, built into the child's IEP, kids, you know, obviously depending on their comprehension level and their ability to understand some of these abstract concepts, kids get it. And if you start bringing your child to IEP meetings at a young age and start talking about their IEP with them in kid language, and you start talking about some of these strategies with them, then you can refer back to their IEP also and say, you know, remember, one of the goals that we're working on is taking a break. And really encouraging the child to know what we're trying to work on so that they can start to have some ownership of it too. Another question was asked, how can parents do the online training modules? I think you had something up on the last slide about that. If you could just reiterate that piece again.
Yeah, I think it's all one word, unstuckandontarget.com. I think is where you find it. But when we send you the slides, it's you can see that slide.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. Bear with me for a moment as I look through it. Oh, another more specific question. We're just about at the end of our questions here. When kids get flooded and overwhelmed with feelings, have you ever seen behavioral symptoms like trichotillomania, compulsive hair pulling, manifesting from this idea of just being so overwhelmed with intense feelings?
Yes. I mean, I think between us, probably we've seen everything. We've seen kids on multiple psychotropic medications. We've seen kids being restrained. We've seen kids who've dissolved into totally anxious, dysfunctional puddles. You know, if you consistently overload a human being, you will elicit really significant psychopathology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and those repetitive behaviors can start as, you know, we think of hair pulling as something that is a habit, and that can be elicited under stress and under boredom. And so that can become a go-to thing right away. But just, you know, I had a child recently where he gets anxious, he gets itchy and uncontrollable itching all over, which is, you know, again, a symptom that we don't necessarily think of with anxiety, but is definitely, and again, these symptoms are real symptoms. They are real physical symptoms that can happen as a consequence of stress and anxiety. So they're not in your head. They're you know, manifestations of anxiety that can, often manifest as headaches and stomach aches and just a general feeling of not being comfortable. But there are some unusual symptoms that go along with those as well, and they're real.
Absolutely.
And it's really important for parents to educate school about what signs your child shows of overload, because it can be really different. My kid gets more impulsive, he gets more oppositional, he pulls his hair, because then people know, oh, we're headed in that direction, we got to pull back, we're going to stop. No more talking, we're going to take a break.
With the ideal goal that down the road, your child can actually say to the staff, when I am getting overwhelmed, this is what I need you to do, or this is what I need you to not do. This is helpful, this is not helpful. Plan A, plan B, right? So it's really important for kids to be starting to take ownership too as they get older, and that's just going to depend on their developmental maturation. But it's a beautiful thing when it actually works and happens eventually. I think that we've run through our questions, and we're coming up on 9 o'clock, so I want to be mindful of your time. I think it's important to encourage parents that you are the expert in your child. And as was shared, if you see things heading south with your kiddo, definitely speak up about it sooner rather than later, and sort of make executive decision. If specials aren't working well and you're online, I don't work for the school, so I'm going to tell you, don't go to specials because it's really a negative trigger for your kid. So prioritize what's important. And of course, communicate with the school, but ultimately, your child, and you have to trust your gut. Something I said in our town hall recently was that we need to rise up and be equal partners with our teachers for both the good, the bad, and the ugly. So keep sharing your expertise about your child with your staff, for sure. Any final words, anything else you want to throw out there to our parents before we wrap up?
Thanks for your attention.
And hang in there. We're all hoping it gets better soon.
Absolutely. Aren't we all? Absolutely. So thank you both so very much for joining us tonight. Again, it's a pleasure to hear you and to get refreshed on some of these concepts again. And having used some of these strategies with my own child, it's really nice to hear them and think, hey, it worked. We're not using that one anymore, but it worked. So that's great. So, thank you. It does work. And again, we really very much appreciate your time and sharing this with us. And hopefully we'll start to see this coming out in our schools a whole lot more. So thank you to everybody who tuned in tonight, and have a wonderful night and be well. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye, everybody.